the Army Commendation Medal for heroic action with Bronze Oakley Cluster, and the Air Medal for heroic action for aerial combat. The South Vietnamese government presented him with the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry with the Palm Unit. Above them all is the Combat Infantry Badge. He's a graduate of Utah State University. He spent a career working for the United States Department of Defense in aircraft simulation and international ballistic missile management positions. His travels have taken him to every state in the Union and over 40 countries. Rocky and his wife Shauna live in Roy, Utah. They have 4 grown children, and Rocky is a volunteer right here at the Aerospace Museum.
Yes.
And I believe he is the author of the highly acclaimed book, Sergeant Rock, The Last Warrior Standing. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome with me now, Rocky.
Thank you, Shirley. I grew up in Sunset, just outside the gates here, so I'm quite at home being here. Thank you all, especially veterans, for being here, and you and your families. I represent the ground-pounding infantry soldier. They took the brunt of the face-to-face combat in Vietnam, and those of you who were in that situation know what I mean. In 1968, the Vietnam War was raging. Hundreds of American boys were being killed every week. I did not want to go there, but if Uncle Sam called, I was willing to defend the interests of my country. I got that famous letter and off I went. I was assigned to the famous 101st Airborne Division and experienced a great deal of up close and personal combat. On December 28th, while most of you were enjoying Christmas, my squad of 12 soldiers were ambushed as we crossed an old rice paddy now filled with thigh-high elephant grass. 30 Viet Cong were hidden in the hedgerows to our front and to our right side. The night before, we'd spent on a little hill called Hill 51. That's the number that was on the Army contour maps. That meant it was 51 meters above sea level. We spent the night up there. In the morning when the sun came up, we brought in our claymores, and the guys brewed up one last cup of coffee and ate some greasy ham and beans, maybe out of their canned sea rations. And the squad leader finally said, "Okay, finish off that coffee, we're getting out of here." We came down off the hill, single file, as infantry does, spread out, so we're not clustered. That tends to make a good target. So we were all spread out. When the last soldier came down off the hill, the enemy guns erupted. As I told you, they were hidden to our right and to our front. They had AK-47s and machine guns. And they had us trapped out in that field with thigh-high grass. We had no place to hide and nothing to hide behind. We did our best to valiantly fight back. But after about 3 minutes, most everybody was gone. I was laying in the grass. I was shooting at an M79 grenade launcher at the time. That's a grenade that shot grenades up into the air. And I had been shooting those as fast as I could put them in my gun and walking them up and down the hedgerow that was to my front, trying to give them some distraction and maybe make them hide instead of shooting at us. Well, all this commotion was still going on. This was 3 minutes later when among all the hubbub, all the noise and the crying for help that I could hear all around me, guys were calling for their mother or calling for the medic, and we had neither one of them. I heard my name called out, Sergeant Rock, Sergeant Rock, are you all right? It was my squad leader, Sergeant Pearson. He was about 15 feet ahead of me in the hedgerow, in the grass. And I yelled back, "I'm okay, I'm here." And he said, "Let's go get him." Now that's a command I would normally hate to hear. Two of us are going to charge one of these hedgerows with all these enemy show soldiers in there with their machine guns. But the alternative was to get killed lying in the grass like all of our brothers were. I knew that within just a couple of seconds I'd be dead. And when he said, "Let's go get him," I jumped up and he and I charged, the two of us. He fired his M16 as fast as he could as we ran. As soon as I jumped up, I saw 3 enemy soldiers manning a machine gun. They were shooting at somebody off to my right. And when they saw me jump up, they moved the machine gun over until it faced me. I knew I had about a half a second to live. Half a second away from being on that black wall in Washington, D.C., as it turns out. He spun the machine gun on me, and I hurried up with my very last grenade that I had. I threw it up, I threw my grenade launcher up, and as it passed, I let that grenade go. I did not want to die cowering on the grass. I wanted to die fighting like a soldier. And I knew I was going to die anyway, so I threw that up, fired that grenade, my last grenade, and it flew true and went right into that machine gun and detonated. And that created a hole for Sergeant Pearson and I to run into. And somehow we made it into the hole without being killed. Once we were in the hedgerow, we were difficult to see, and the enemy were hesitant about shooting in there because there were other Viet Cong in there, and they'd be shooting at each other, trying to shoot at us in the middle. So it wasn't more than 10 seconds that we were in that hedgerow when all of a sudden I heard the whop, 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 whop of the Huey gunships coming in, and they started strafing and rocketing the hedgerows, and the enemy started to run. They didn't like those helicopters, and they started to run. To my rear, I saw about 10 soldiers running through the field behind me on the other side of the hedgerow, and just out of pure adrenaline, I jumped up and started chasing them. I have no grenades for my gun. All I had was a bayonet on my side, and I was chasing these 10 armed enemy soldiers. I got about 15 strides, I guess, through the next field when Sergeant Pearson again hollered at me, "Get your butt back here." He used a little more descriptive words though. And all of a sudden I realized what I had done. You know, sometimes you do things just because you're so pumped up, and that's what you do. And boy, and trying to get back to him was a real task, because it seemed like every vine and every blade of grass grabbed at my feet until I made it back. About the time I made it back, Huey medevacs were landing in the field, and Sergeant Pearson and I ran out and helped load up our dead and dying brothers, who I've never seen since.
Want to try a blueberry?
Time prevents me from telling more stories like this incident. I could tell you about them all afternoon. They come front and center to my mind. Time and talking about those experiences with others like you has helped me control those mostly terrible thoughts. If you are a veteran of any war and you have any PTSD issues, I invite you to visit the VA, talk about these hidden issues with professionals and other vets who have like memories. I suffered for 5 years with things my wife and family didn't know about, and I just couldn't talk about it. I couldn't tell them what had happened. It was still Terrible things that I had seen or done weighed heavily in my heart. I did not know what to do about it. One night, as I sat with a bunch of Boy Scouts around a dying campfire in the high Uinta Mountains, I let some of my forbidden stories out. That was just the beginning of my way back for me. Now I can tell stories like the one you've just heard and stay composed. Your partners and grandchildren deserve to know what makes you who you are. Do not let that which torments you remain hidden in your minds. Do not die having told no one. I wrote about book about Vietnam, Sergeant Rock, Last Warrior Standing. That also helped me to write down some of my issues. New subject. When the last combat troops were being withdrawn from Vietnam by direction of the President of the United States, some far-left news media began to say we had lost the war. The phrase quickly caught on, and at that time it was hard to argue otherwise. With the passage of time, we have learned that is not true. I am happy to defend my military brothers and sisters and explain why. One of the reasons we went to Vietnam was to stop the communist domino effect that was happening all over Asia, including South Vietnam. As a matter of fact, small groups of communist rebels were spreading their cause all over the world. Young warriors from America were asked to help stem that seemingly indomitable onslaught. Then, after more than 10 years, we were ordered to return home. Let me read a paragraph I cut from the Ogden Standard-Examiner newspaper in 1992. That article was very important to me. It was written by the Associated Press in Saigon and republished by probably thousands of newspapers, including the Ogden Standard-Examiner. And this is what the author in Vietnam said. The U.S. 101st Airborne Division, the captor of bloody Hamburger Hill, began phasing out of combat today, 6 weeks ahead of schedule, as part of an accelerated troop pullout to send thousands of GIs home from Vietnam for Christmas. The 101st is the last remaining combat division in Vietnam. That was dated November the 20th, 1971. So we were all gone except the 101st Airborne in 1971. NVA soldiers, all combat ground troops were out of South Vietnam by early in 1972. All combat troops. NVA soldiers did not take South Vietnam for a full year, because a full 3 years before we had already withdrawn. We could not have lost the war. We weren't even there when the NVA attacked. It's been, as I mentioned, 3 years had gone by since we had been there. I have read several accounts that the Soviet Union was within a month of cutting off all supplies and manpower to support the North Vietnamese. The American warriors had won every major battle, and the Soviets were almost bankrupt for supporting the war. The Soviet people were rebelling from high taxes and poor living conditions. Just 10 years later, the Soviet Union ceased supporting communist causes around the world. With no support, 4 years later, in 1989, East Germany collapsed. The Cold War ended that same year. In 1990, the Soviet Union leaders were out of power, and the country began to implode. Also in 1990, all former communist regimes in Eastern Europe were were replaced by democratic elected governments. Thus began the reverse domino effect with the Soviet threat on the ash heap of history. 14 countries in Africa abandoned communist ideology. The same thing can be said about South American and Asian countries. The same thing all over the world, countries are separating themselves from communism. Today, Vietnamese people call themselves socialists instead of the government owns everything communists. The rice farmers plant and sell produce from their own land. Shopkeepers and other entrepreneurs keep the money they earn. The beaches we fought on now contain hotels and restaurants from Europe and America. The 158,000 warriors whose names are on the black granite wall in Washington, D.C., and we who made it home, bled the Soviet resources dry. We no longer build bomb shelters in our backyards or store civil defense crackers in them. Missile alert sirens no longer exist in our communities. In school, we were taught to drop, duck, and roll under our desk if a nuclear warhead was coming our way. Today, we have little to fear of nuclear warheads driving from the sky, or falling from the sky. Not only did we not lose the war, we may have, in fact, saved the world from atomic destruction.
It's true.
I thank you all for that. God bless.
Thank you, Sergeant Ross.